Welcome to today's program entitled, What Every Agent Should Know When Selling Environmental Coverage. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question and answer session. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit your questions through the presentation by selecting the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen and then typing and send your message. For optimal sound quality, it is recommended that you listen to the conference via your telephone. Please do not forget to turn off your computer speakers if you choose to listen over the phone. Look at the top left-hand column and click the speaker icon to turn the computer speakers on and off. If you choose to listen to the conference through the computer speakers and you experience any problems with the internet sound quality, please dial back on your telephone. And now, I'd like to introduce your speaker for today's call, Mr. Bill Pritchard. Bill is President and CEO of Beacon Hill Associates, a wholesale insurance broker and a program administrator. Since 1990, Beacon Hill has specialized in the placement of environmental insurance and other specialty coverages for agents around the country. Bill is a third-generation insurance professional and teaches pollution insurance classes nationwide. Welcome, Bill. You may begin.
Thank you, Diana. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what every agent should know when thinking about environmental insurance opportunities. It's a brief housekeeping thing. Diana mentioned asking any questions that you might have during the presentation. I just wanted to reinforce that there's a question and answer section, I believe, on the left of your screen. And anything that occurs to you as I'm talking, please go ahead and just jot it down while you think of it. And then we're hopefully going to have a few minutes at the end to answer some questions for folks. So just getting started here. What we're going to cover today is talking about the fact that every client you have and every prospect you're thinking about or interested in has an environmental exposure. And so what we'll talk about is sort of how to find those and how to see that, and then how to have a conversation with your client about is it significant enough to transfer that risk through insurance. We'll talk a little bit about the coverage, presenting the coverage to your client and the benefits and pitfalls that has for you as an agent. We'll talk a little bit about the environmental products themselves and how they work. They're different, and the issues you have to be aware of when considering different types of risks versus different types of coverage. And then we'll talk about applying for the insurance coverage itself and how really easy that is to do. So getting started, I think the most important thing to begin with is realizing where the pollution exposure comes from for an insured. And I think the biggest stumbling block most insureds have is their perception of what their risk is. So many insureds don't think they have a pollution exposure because they don't think they work with pollutants. And in their mind they're thinking toxic materials, nuclear materials, hazardous materials that are placarded, that sort of thing. And so many insureds say, well, you know, I'm not in that business, I don't do that, so I don't have a pollution exposure. But that's not really where the pollution exposure for insureds comes from. It comes from their GL form and the pollution exclusion in the form. So it's really important to, as you begin to think about looking at your book of business and having these conversations with your clients, that you sit down and read that pollution exclusion. And it defines a pollutant as really, and I've got it here on the slide, any solid, liquid, gaseous, or thermal irritant or contaminant, including smoke, vapor, soot, fumes, acids, etc., etc. So what you're getting is a very, very broad definition of things that don't belong where they are, and that effectively making them a pollutant. So when you take that definition and that exclusion in your GL coverage and apply it to what your contractor or consultant or facility does and has an exposure to, you'll see that there's lots and lots of pollution opportunities in what people are doing based on that broad definition. So, using that as a starting point, who has the exposure? And this is just a very, very limited list of people that have a pollution exposure. And just using it as an example, grading and site preparation contractors have a pollution exposure. Roofing contractors, plumbers, air conditioning, heating, mechanical contractors, window glazers, general contractors, electricians, et cetera, et cetera. A more facility-based exposure would be warehousing, contractor yards, manufacturers, hotels, doctor's offices, retail, developers, apartment buildings, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. Those are just very general representations, I think, of the types of businesses that probably would answer that question, do you feel like you have a pollution exposure, with a no. But the reality is they do, and we'll talk a little bit more in the following slides about where, how you address that exposure and how you can cover it. But just as an example, a grading or site prep contractor certainly has a pollution exposure. They bring fuels to job sites. They bring materials to job sites that could be released into the environment, into a stream or whatever it might be. You think of a contractor putting a tack coat layer down on a highway. If that tack coat is washed off by a thunderstorm into a neighboring stream, that's a pollution loss. That same grading contractor could inadvertently spread contaminated soil around a property without realizing it, but still be held responsible for it. Or they could inadvertently dig up a storage tank no one knew was there. And again, be held responsible for part of the cleanup associated with it. And those types of exposures just track through all these different classes of business as things that could happen, and things that, based on that broad pollution exclusion in the GL form, would not typically be covered by most programs. Why you should bring up the exposures, I think, is an important thing to give some thought to. These can be difficult conversations. I have visited with a number of agents over the years while they had been presenting to their client their pollution exposures and the plan for addressing those. And many insureds think they already have this coverage. So it's a hard thing for an agent to explain to his client that in fact he does not have that coverage, and that he may need to buy a different policy to address it more completely. That's the challenge. The upside is that it really defines your agency as a more professional operation, and certainly sets you apart, I think, from most other agencies in terms of the thoroughness and detail that you're bringing to your professional. And I think that goes a long way with most insureds, is realizing that their agent is having the tough conversations and giving them the opportunity to make a choice about whether they want to transfer that risk or not. Going further, it obviously brings in additional revenue on an account to the agency. It also makes coverage more difficult for someone else to take away. When you've written a unique and slightly different environmental coverage to enhance what your client has, a competitor is going to have a more challenging time trying to lever that piece of business away from you at renewal. And it certainly helps address agency E&O issues from a scope of coverage standpoint. So I think there are a lot of positives to bringing it up. There are a lot of positives to having the conversation, and really very few pitfalls. So I think it's an important thing to consider doing with every account. In order to really figure out the opportunity for each individual piece of business you have, I think the starting point is figuring out what type of coverage you'd want to look at. And it's really, environmental insurance is really broken into two broad categories. One of those is operational or service-based. And this is pollution coverage for insureds where the exposure is generated by their actual operations they perform for others. So these policies typically provide coverage for pollution conditions caused by an insured's operations performed for others away from premises they own, rent, occupy, etc. So this is going to be the insurance you'd want to look for anyone who's providing a service to a third party. The other main category is location or premises specific. And this is an exposure generated by a specific piece of property, whether it's ownership or operation of a location. But it's basically the pollution that might emanate from that site. And so when you think about it, you take a contracting risk, for example. They really have both exposures. General contractor is a great example. They have a field exposure, operational exposure, where they're going out and doing work for others, but they also have a location or premises specific exposure, which is their home base, where they're storing their heavy equipment, they're maintaining their vehicles, they're refueling, doing oil changes, that sort of thing. And so there really is, for that type of risk, are two different ways to look at the exposure and two different opportunities to talk about additional coverage. A little more detail on how these work. The operational service-based policies basically will provide coverage for pollution conditions caused by operations performed by or on behalf of an insured away from their premises. This policy may or may not be written with mold coverage. That's something that you hear a lot about these days and is the driver for a lot of folks considering coverage. Take a roofing contractor, for example. If a roofer installs flashing incorrectly on a roof and there's moisture leaking into the attic and mold grows, you need to have a policy where mold is actually considered a pollutant under that pollution policy for the coverage to work effectively for them. But that really gives them that job site pollution coverage. But then you can endorse onto that other extensions of coverage, over-the-road pollution, which is the transportation of waste or pollutants. We've written over-the-road pollution coverage for painting contractors for the transportation of paint, for folks delivering batteries to auto supply stores, all sorts of risks like that. There's a non-owned disposal site coverage opportunity, which is providing an extension that applies to where the contractor may dispose of his waste. There's their own premises liability, which we mentioned earlier. Products pollution, which is any product the insured might have and sell to others. If that product were to fail and lead to a pollution loss, then products pollution coverage would apply as opposed to just products liability. And then there's coverage for the exposure from underground and above ground storage tanks that many of these insureds will have. And those can all be added to or addressed in one way or another through an operational based policy. Who typically buys it? Contractors and consultants often do it. They do it because of a variety of different exposures. One is that they bring contaminants to a job site. So that could be paint, solvents, cleaning materials, fuels, etc. It could be coming from the operations they perform at the site, so they might exacerbate an existing condition. So if they're trenching or drilling holes or doing grading, they could definitely exacerbate or cause a condition at the site. They could have a completed operations type exposure where they install drain pipes incorrectly, or an HVAC contractor could install a duct incorrectly, leading to mold growth. So there are lots of those completed ops exposures that could happen too. So there's a variety of ways that a contractor or a purchaser of contractor's pollution liability could cause a pollution event that they'd want to be able to purchase coverage for. Going on to the fixed location or facility-based exposures, again, this is a policy that provides coverage for pollution conditions at, on, or emanating from a specific location. And it can include a lot of different things. And these policies are written in a way that there's a great deal of flexibility in how you can structure the coverage for your insured. So they can include on and off-site cleanup coverage, bodily injury, and property damage. They can be written in a way that they only cover new conditions after the purchase of the policy, or they could be written to only cover unknown pre-existing conditions that occurred prior to the inception date of the policy, or a retroactive date or whatever identifying date is used by that coverage form. So a great deal of flexibility in terms of how you can use this to transfer environmental risk for location. Again, just as CPL can, they can be written to include mold coverage. We write a lot of policies these days for indoor air quality related issues. Those all have a mold component because mold spores are one of the concerns that lead to indoor air quality problems in buildings. And that seems to be a driver of a lot of interest in the market now. So they can also enhance these coverages by adding things like business interruption from pollution events, which is different than the business interruption that your property policy might have, as well as loss of rents. You can add on incidental coverage for a contracting exposure. So, for example, we wrote an electrician at one point where we did a facility coverage for their facility, but then also did a contractor's pollution extension because they went out in the field and did work in the field and also brought transformers back to their property. So we wanted to be able to cover both components of their exposure in one form. And then underground storage tank coverage. And even though it's a premises-specific policy, underground storage tanks are not typically automatically covered by those forms. That's an extension that you have to talk to your underwriter about having added to the coverage. Examples of people who will buy premises pollution are insureds with any sort of repair, manufacturing, service work performed at their location. That can be waste oil, solvents, fuels. Insureds with neighbors that might contaminate their site. One of the great things about site pollution policies is that they typically provide coverage for contamination on your site without a limitation as to where that contamination comes from. So in some cases you'll see a site that is contaminated by an upgradient neighbor who it turns out is unable to deal with their environmental liability for contamination of your site, and then this policy obviously protects the owner of our property. Also can be extended to entities that might lease a site that's a neighbor and might ultimately contaminate your site, as well as people who lease an owned premises. So we write coverage for a great number of light industrial risks where they lease out parts of their property to different types of insureds who do different operations that might bring contaminants onto the site. And again, contaminants could be fuels, they could be cleaning solvents, they could be acids, they could be all sorts of things that are brought to the site just in the normal course of their business that if they're dropped in a storm drain or spill in some way or another may cause a pollution release. And then it also addresses insureds with concerns about unknown pre-existing conditions at a site. And that's a big issue for purchasers of properties or sellers of properties. Protecting the unknown in a transaction like that can very often be something that is best accomplished by using an insurance policy. So that's definitely an area that we've seen a huge amount of growth in the marketplace in the last 3 or 4 years. Additional coverages that you can look at, and we talked about some of these previously, is products pollution. And again, that's the failure of an insured's product. So if you, for example, had an insured that reconditions drums, and they were to sell a reconditioned drum and that drum were to fail and cause a pollution release, that pollutant cleanup and associated bodily injury and property damage would be addressed by our policy. And again, it's something where you see some carriers that do products liability not extending it to the pollution exposure from the failure of the product. And so it's important to look at that coverage gap and determine if a separate policy would be helpful. Those can be written on a monoline basis. You don't have to write this as part of a larger package policy. Transportation or over-the-road exposures, it's really responsibility for products or waste being transported. We write a lot of this on a monoline basis where an insured has an exposure for transporting drums from job sites. We write policies for people who transport dumpsters, roll-off dumpsters from construction debris, job sites to landfills. And they're worried about that over-the-road pollution exposure. And again, this can be written on a monoline basis. Non-owned disposal site exposures typically is written attached to another coverage part, but that addresses the responsibility an insured has for disposal of their waste. If you generate waste in your process, whether you're a manufacturer or a contractor or what have you, when you dispose of that at a facility, there's potential for you to have responsibility for that facility at some point in the future if in fact it has an environmental problem and you're identified as a contributor to that. This extension of coverage is available to protect the insured in the event they get brought into something along those lines. And then storage tank coverage. Storage tank insurance is a very vital part of a good risk management program for people who have that exposure. People tend not to worry too much about the tanks, but something underground that has the potential to leak over time without anyone being aware of it can lead to some pretty significant losses. We've seen a growing interest in contractors wanting to cover the tanks they have at their equipment yards that they use for refueling vehicles, as well as waste storage tanks, that sort of thing, waste oil storage tanks. So a lot of opportunity in that area as well. Important considerations when you're thinking about environmental products. I think probably the most important thing to keep in mind is that no two environmental insurance companies that I'm aware of use the same form. They are all proprietary to the carriers. The vast majority of this business is written on an excess and surplus lines basis, and each company has created their own coverage product. They all sort of stem from the same handful of companies initially, but over the years they have changed so that each company's coverage is done the way that company wants to offer it. And so it's very, very important when you're looking at products, when you're comparing coverage, that you just don't look at the title, contractor's pollution liability, for example, but really dive into the form and really get comfortable with what's being given and what's being offered to your client, because there are some significant coverage differences that really make a difference. And very often when you see big price disparities between 2 or 3 different offers, you'll find that that comes back to what's being offered as far as coverage goes. So it's really important to spend time understanding the form you're working with. Another really important consideration is the security of the carrier that's offering coverage, and that's AM Best rating is first and foremost. I have yet to see a contract requirement for a contractor that's looking for something less than an A- rating from a company, and some are higher than that. Making sure that company is going to be able to support that requirement and that obligation on the insured is important. We look at the commitment the carrier has to the environmental industry. How broad is the range of products they offer? How long have they been doing it? Is their environmental department really committed to this line of business, or is it a few people writing a different coverage for a company? Because we feel like that makes a difference in terms of where they'll be in 3 or 4 or 5 years in terms of being able to continue to service the business that we write for them. And then claims handling is crucially important. The bigger environmental firms have dedicated environmental claims handling people, and pollution claims are different than general casualty claims. And I think it's really important to make sure that you partner with a company who's made that commitment to being able to address the claims and do them properly. And then the last thing I think that's important to keep in mind is the ability of the carrier to respond to midterm changes and needs. We very often have insureds who partway through a policy term will come back and say, I just got a new contract. They require me to carry $5 million for this one project. Can I add it to my current program? And being with companies that have the ability to do that have a range of products and the ability to add them on to your program as you might need them, is just very helpful. And it's a good partnership then between the insurance company and the insured if they can work well together. So I think as you start looking at environmental products and people to work with, it's important to keep those things in mind. Some of the details on the coverages, contractors pollution liability, minimum premiums start as low as $2,500. It's very affordable coverage now. There is a fair amount of misunderstanding in the industry, in the contracting world in particular, about the cost of pollution coverage. Long ago it used to be very expensive, but it isn't any longer. Limits from $500,000 and up. We write some programs that have over $50 million of limits. So there really isn't an upper end that you have to worry about. Contractors pollution can be offered on claims made or an occurrence form. More often than not today we find it on an occurrence form, but it can be claims made, and it's awfully important to be comfortable with what that means and how we're going to deal with that in terms of if you're working on a new account that used to be claims made and you want it to be occurrence, you've got to address those things. And retentions are as low as $2,500. Premises pollution minimum premiums are as low as $1,000. It's more like $2,500 to $3,000. There's some low limit programs that could be as low as $1,000, but realistically, I think of it more in the $2,500 range. And again, that's almost always offered as a claims made form, and so retroactive dates and paying attention to those details are very, very important. Submission requirements for the general contractor CPL, accord applications to get started, to get an idea of what coverage would cost, loss experience, and then an understanding of if they want mold coverage or not are important things. Just to get an idea of what a company would want to charge you to start the process. Most carriers will need a proprietary application to bind an account, but this will get the process started. For a premises, you need a site application, a good narrative of the goal of the coverage, and then copies of any environmental site information that might be available. And that's going to be phase 1s, phase 2s, any environmental surveys that were done are really important. For storage tanks, a completed underground storage tank application, and again, copies of any tightness tests or remediation phase 1, 2 reports that might have been done for the site. As an office, Beacon Hill works as a wholesale broker. We've specialized in environmental insurance for 24 years now. We also are a program underwriter for environmental insurance products through our Partner One underwriting division. So this is really all we do every day is environmental and energy related business. We have great access to the marketplace, great relationships with companies that write a lot of this business and do it very, very well. Our folks have a very good understanding of the coverages that you're going to be working with and the differences between different carriers' coverages, and can spend a lot of time helping you understand that. And then post-binding, we have dedicated service teams that we frankly meet every week to make sure we're getting endorsements out as quickly as possible and getting things back to agents as quickly as we can post-binding, so that the process of being insured with us is as good as it was getting the business written. So a lot of information on our website, coverage guides, environmental frequently asked questions, claim scenarios, etc. All the applications for our carriers are on our website, and so there's a lot of information there that you can find if you're interested. And so in summary, it's a competitive marketplace, and we think it's really important that every agent take every opportunity to strengthen their relationship with their client. Every account is a good account, and every account is an opportunity to forge a relationship that will last for years. And we believe environmental insurance can be very helpful in your doing that. So I did have a couple of questions I wanted to try to answer for folks. I think I have a minute or two left to go. Somebody had asked me the question at one point, what is the turnaround time and how long does it take to quote an environmental policy? And I can tell you that on a contractor side, we can do indications for coverage very, very quickly based on the information we had in here. We can usually get a response from a carrier in a day or two just with a ballpark, and then bindable quote will depend on how much information we've been given. But the vast majority of our new business here gets written within a week or two of receiving the submission. So we're very good at getting quick answers back to you. And I think that's a lot of what it takes to be successful in the market right now is being responsive. Premises pollution policies take a little bit longer because that information tends to be a little bit more complicated to review. But again, I just wrote an account today that we got in last Friday, so it can be done quickly, and depending on the information we have, we can get it done pretty fast for you. So, another question I was asked is, when's a good time to bring this up with your client? And I would say, the best time probably is at renewal or coming up to renewal. We have some tools in our office that we can share with you that actually will help give your insured an understanding of their exposure and an idea of roughly what coverage would cost and why they should buy it before the renewal process. So if you contact us and talk to us about an account you have coming up in a few weeks, we can get some materials in your hands that I think will do a good job helping your client see the exposure and maybe helping you have that conversation. So I think that's it as far as questions for right now. So Diana, I guess what I will do is turn it back over to you. And I'd just like to thank everybody before I go for taking the time to spend with us today. And I hope you found this helpful. My contact number is on the last slide, so please feel free to give me a call directly if you have any questions or if there's anything I can help with.
Thank you, Bill. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending today's webinar. This does conclude our webinar. Thank you for your attendance.